My name is Arthur Mendes. I'm 76 years old, and I have lived alone for nearly a decade now in a small property in the interior of Minas Gerais. The house sits at the edge of the world, or so it feels most days, surrounded by cornfields that whisper in the wind and hills that roll away into silence. After my wife Aunt Clara died of pneumonia, the house became too large, the silence too heavy. I would walk from room to room and find her absence in every corner, in the way light fell through the kitchen window at noon, in the empty chair at the dining table, in the unworn slippers by the bed. My children live in different cities now, scattered like seeds carried off by a strong wind. They rarely call. At first, I resented the quiet. Then I grew accustomed to it. Then I came to depend on it. There is something oddly comforting in knowing that no one will knock on your door, that no one expects anything from you, that the days can pass in their own rhythm, unmarked by appointments or obligations or the small violences of social interaction. Out here, time moves differently. It stretches and contracts like the wooden boards of the porch at night, creaking under the weight of temperature and age. I have learned to listen to those sounds. They are my companions now. My routine is simple and predictable, the kind of rhythm that keeps a man from thinking too much. I wake before the sun, when the air is still cool and the horizon glows faint and grey. I make strong coffee in the old aluminum pot, the kind that hisses and spits on the stove, filling the kitchen with a bitter, familiar smell. I feed the chickens, scattering grain across the dirt while they cluck and peck around my boots, oblivious to everything but their hunger. Then I spend the rest of the day fixing the things that age corrodes: tiles loosened by rain, fence posts rotted at the base, the engine of the old tractor that coughs and refuses to turn over. The television barely works out here. The signal comes and goes, leaving only static and ghostly images. The radio, with its constant hiss and crackle, is my only real contact with the world beyond the property. I listen to the news sometimes, though it all feels distant and unreal, like stories from another life. I keep a notebook where I write down everything that happens, even the small things. The first sparrow I see in spring, the day the well water turns cloudy, the price of beans at the market in town. It is a way of keeping my mind occupied, of proving to myself that I am still here, still observing, still part of the slow turning of the world. Clara used to tease me about it. She would say I was building a monument to boredom. Maybe she was right. But now that she is gone, the notebook feels like evidence of something, proof that my days have not simply evaporated into the heat. I have become attuned to the small changes in the landscape, the way the light shifts as the seasons pass, the smell of the earth after rain, rich and dark and alive, the sound of the wind moving through the corn, a dry rustling that rises and falls like breathing. I know the birds by their songs. I can tell when a storm is coming by the way the air thickens and the insects go quiet. I have lived long enough to understand that the world speaks, if you are patient enough to listen. It was on one of those mornings, early and still and smelling of wet earth, that I first noticed the silence was different. I had stepped out onto the porch with my coffee, the steam rising in slow spirals against the pale sky, and I realized that there were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no distant hum of life. The entire field seemed to be holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, cup in hand, listening to the absence of sound. It pressed against my ears like water, thick and strange. At the time, I dismissed it. I told myself it was nothing, just one of those inexplicable quirks of nature, the kind of thing that happens and passes without explanation. But now, looking back, I understand that it was a warning. The land was trying to tell me something. I should have paid more attention. I should have recognized the silence for what it was, a pause before something breaks. Out here, you learn that there are rhythms beneath the rhythms, patterns that exist just below the surface of ordinary life. You learn that the world is not as solid as it seems, that there are cracks in the fabric of the everyday, places where something else can slip through. I have always known this in an abstract way, the way you know that storms come and trees fall and people die. But I had never felt it so clearly, so viscerally as I did that morning. The sun rose slowly, as it always does, burning off the mist that clung to the low places in the field. The day began like any other. I fed the chickens. I checked the fence line. I drank my coffee and listened to the radio, which crackled with reports of drought in the north and floods in the south, disasters that felt impossibly far away. But beneath the ordinary surface of the day, something had shifted. The air felt different. The light looked wrong. I could not name what it was, but I felt it in my chest, a tightness that would not go away. I have lived long enough to trust my instincts. When the body tells you something is wrong, it is usually right, even if the mind cannot yet see the danger. So I paid attention. I watched the horizon. I listened to the wind. And I waited, because that is what you do when you are old and alone and the world suddenly feels unfamiliar. You wait for the shape of the threat to reveal itself. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sun set, the sky bleeding orange and red and purple across the hills. The dog was restless, pacing back and forth in the yard, whining softly. I called to him, Das, but he would not come. He kept looking toward the hills, toward the tree line, as if he could see something I could not. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, only the dark silhouette of the forest against the fading light. I went to bed that night with a strange heaviness in my chest, a feeling I could not shake. I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of the roof, the tick of the cooling stove. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the barn. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a hand. And then, far off in the distance, I heard it, a sound like thunder, but wrong, irregular, metallic. It rolled across the hills and faded, leaving only the wind behind. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. But the sound did not come again. Only the wind, only the silence, and the certainty, growing in my chest like a cold stone, that something had changed. It happened on a late afternoon, when the sky had turned that particular shade of brass that means the day is dying. I was on the porch, mending a section of harness that had split, the leather stiff and reluctant under my fingers. The air was still, heavy with the promise of rain that never came. That is when I heard it, a sound from the direction of the hills, distant but unmistakable. It was metallic, irregular, like thunder that had gotten stuck in its own throat. There was a grinding quality to it, a mechanical roar that rose and fell and rose again, punctuated by something that sounded almost like screaming metal. I stood up, the harness falling forgotten to the floor, and walked to the edge of the porch. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill the entire valley. It was the sound of something falling, something heavy and mechanical and wrong. I could hear the whine of turbines, or what I thought were turbines, and beneath it a deeper thrumming that I felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of my feet and settled in my teeth. Then I saw it. Far off, above the tree line on the ridge behind the property, a light appeared. It blinked white, then red, then white again, moving erratically across the darkening sky. It reminded me of a plane in distress, but the movement was too violent, too uncontrolled. It tilted and dropped and seemed to catch itself before dropping again. The sound reached a crescendo, a shrieking roar that made my ears ring. And then there was a flash, brief and brilliant, like lightning but concentrated. A single point of white fire that lit up the entire ridge. The sound stopped, just like that, cut off as if someone had closed a door. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud in the still air. The echo of the sound rolled across the valley, bouncing off the hills, fading slowly into nothing. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, staring at the ridge where the light had been. A thin column of smoke was beginning to rise, dark against the dimming sky. I should have felt fear, but what I felt was something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the kind of detached fascination that comes when you witness something you cannot immediately understand. I went inside and found my old binoculars, the ones I had used for birdwatching back when Clara was alive. I wiped the lenses on my shirt and went back out to the porch and scanning the ridge. Through the binoculars, I could see it clearly. Something large and metallic, half hidden among the trees, smoke pouring from it in thick, oily waves. At first glance, it looked like a helicopter, military from the shape of it, though I am no expert. The body was dark, twisted, the rotor blades bent at impossible angles, but there was no movement around it. No figures running, no signs of rescue or response. Just the wreckage and the smoke, rising steadily into the evening air. I watched for a long time, until the light faded and I could no longer make out the details. I expected to see lights arriving, vehicles, people. Military accidents are not unheard of in this region. We are not far from training routes, and I have heard the sound of low-flying aircraft before. But as the hours passed, nothing came. No searchlights swept the ridge. No helicopters circled overhead. The smoke continued to rise, a dark pillar against the stars. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the house. Every creak and groan suddenly loud and significant. My mind kept returning to the wreckage, to the wrongness of the silence that had followed the crash. Where were the rescuers? Why had no one come? I told myself there were explanations. Perhaps the military was handling it quietly. Perhaps they had cordoned off the area, and I simply had not seen them. But doubt gnawed at me, a small voice that whispered that something was not right. The next morning, I rose early and looked toward the ridge. The smoke was still there, thinner now but persistent. It had a strange quality to it, darker than normal smoke, and it seemed to hang in the air rather than dissipate. I could smell it faintly, carried on the wind, a smell that was not quite like burning fuel. It was heavier, richer, almost organic, like meat left too long on a fire. I decided to leave it alone. Out here, you learn not to ask too many questions. You learn that some things are not your business, that poking into the affairs of the military or the government only brings trouble. But the smoke lingered for days, and the smell came and went with the shifting wind, and I found myself looking toward the ridge more and more often, wondering what was up there, what had fallen from the sky and now lay broken among the trees. On the third night I heard the footsteps. It was late, out past midnight, and I had been drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep. The sound woke me fully, slow, heavy, deliberate. Something was moving in the yard, just outside the house. I could hear the crunch of gravel, the scrape of something being dragged across the ground. My dog, Rex, began to howl from where he was chained near the barn. It was not his usual bark, sharp and aggressive. This was different. This was fear. I got out of bed and moved to the window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and clicked it on, shining it through the glass. The beam swept across the yard, illuminating nothing but the usual shapes. The old tractor, the fence posts, the chicken coop. But the grass was flattened, pressed down in a wide path that led from the tree line toward the house. Whatever had made those tracks was heavy, much heavier than a person. I moved from window to window, shining the light into the darkness, but I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Rex was still howling, a sound that scraped against my nerves and made my skin prickle. I wanted to go outside, to see what had been there, but something stopped me. Some deep animal instinct that told me to stay inside, to lock the doors, to wait for morning. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, the flashlight in my lap, listening to every sound. The wind in the corn, the creak of the roof, the distant, barely audible hum that seemed to come from the direction of the ridge. When dawn finally came, pale and grey, I went outside. The tracks were still there. I knelt down and examined them, running my fingers along the edge of the flattened grass. The earth was compressed, as if something immensely heavy had passed over it. But there were no clear footprints, no distinct shapes. Just this wide, dragging path that started at the tree line and came within 10 feet of the house, before turning back toward the woods. I followed the trail to the edge of the property, where it disappeared into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, staring into the shadows beneath the trees, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The birds were still absent. The air was still and cold, and somewhere, far off, I could still smell that strange organic smoke, carried on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. I went back to the house and locked the doors. I told myself I was being irrational, that there was an explanation for everything, the crash, the smoke, the tracks. But my hands were shaking as I made coffee, and I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something looking back at me. The world had shifted, imperceptibly but irrevocably, and I knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest, that whatever had fallen from the sky was still out there, watching, waiting. Sleep became impossible after that night. I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, watching the shadows move as the moon passed behind clouds, listening to every sound with a hyper-awareness that left me exhausted. On the fourth night after the crash, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, a sound that made my blood run cold. It came from the direction of the ridge, cutting through the silence like a blade. A scream, if you could call it that, long, metallic, almost human, but not quite. It had the quality of steel scraping against steel, but underneath there was something else, something that reminded me of a voice trying to form words it did not know. The sound rose and fell, wavering, echoing across the valley before fading into nothing. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and made a decision I would later question. I got dressed in the dark, pulling on my worn work pants and boots, and went to the closet where I kept my old recording equipment. Years ago, before I retired, I had worked as a reporter for a small regional paper. I still had the old handheld recorder, the kind with tape, clunky and outdated but functional. I checked the batteries, loaded a fresh tape, and grabbed the flashlight. If something was happening, if I was not losing my mind, then I needed evidence. I needed proof. The air outside was cold and still, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than seemed possible, each one sharp and distant. I could see my breath, pale clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. The corn whispered around me as I walked, the stalks rustling with a sound like rain. I kept the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, following the direction of the sound by memory. The scream came again, closer this time, and I felt my legs slow, some part of me screaming to turn back, to return to the safety of the house. But I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, my hand gripping the recorder so tightly my knuckles ached. I reached the edge of the cornfield where it gave way to the tree line, and I stopped, pressing the record button on the device. The tape began to turn whir, that faint mechanical whisper that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The forest ahead was a wall of darkness, impenetrable, the trees rising like silent sentinels. I could hear nothing now except my own breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Then movement, a shadow detaching from the other shadows, shifting between the trees perhaps 30 yards ahead. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and for an instant, just an instant, I saw it clearly. Her figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing at the edge of the trees. Its body was covered in something dark, something that looked like mud or ash or soot, matted and glistening in the light. But the shape was wrong. The proportions were off. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, and the way it moved, that was the worst part. It moved like something trying to remember how humans moved, like a broken puppet, jerking on half-severed strings. My hand began to shake, the beam of light wavering. I could not move, could not think. I stood there, frozen, as the figure took a step forward. Then another. The movements were disjointed, mechanical, one leg dragging slightly as if it did not quite bend at the right places. It came closer, entering the circle of light, and I heard a sound I will never forget. A breathing sound, low and wet and labored, like lungs struggling to process air they were not designed for. So I raised the flashlight higher, illuminating what I can only describe as a face. The skin was stretched tight, almost translucent, shining with moisture or some other fluid. I could see the shape of bone beneath, the architecture of something that was almost human but fundamentally alien. The eyes were too large, set too wide apart, and they caught the light like the eyes of an animal, reflecting it back in a way that made my stomach turn. There was no white to them, no iris I could distinguish, just that terrible and reflective shine. It opened its mouth, if that cavity could be called a mouth, and made another sound. This time it was lower, more controlled. Words, or what might have been words, if words could be garbled and reversed and spoken through water. I heard syllables that almost formed into speech, a voice that was trying to shape itself into something recognizable, and failing. The consonants were wrong, the vowels stretched and distorted. It sounded like a recording played backward, or a voice heard through static. And then it said something that froze me to the core. It said my name, or something that sounded like my name, broken and reassembled wrong. Arthur, Arthur, the syllables drawn out, mechanical, like a machine learning to speak for the first time. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight and the recorder. The figure tilted its head, that same jerking, unnatural movement, and took another step forward. That is when I ran. I turned and fled through the corn, branches whipping against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear it moving. The sound of something large pushing through the stalks, that wet breathing following me. But I did not look back. I ran until I reached the house, threw myself through the door and locked it behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the bolt. I collapsed against the door, sliding to the floor, the recorder clutched against my chest. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the sound of my own panicked breathing filling the silence. Outside, nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the wind and the corn and the terrible, pressing weight of the darkness. I did not move for a long time. I sat there on the floor until the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, turning the world grey and then gold. Only then did I stand, my legs stiff and aching, and look at the recorder in my hands. The tape was still turning. I rewound it and pressed play, listening with held breath to the sounds I had captured. The rustle of corn, my footsteps, the scream metallic and long, and then faint but unmistakable, that broken voice speaking my name. When the sun was fully up, I forced myself to go back to the edge of the woods. I needed to see it in daylight, to confirm that what I had witnessed was real and not some fever dream born of isolation and fear. I found the spot easily enough, following the broken cornstalks, and there, at the tree line, I found evidence. Pieces of fabric, blackened and melted, lay scattered among the leaves. The material was synthetic, thick, possibly military issue, but it had been burned and twisted beyond recognition. I picked up a piece with trembling fingers and examined it. The edges were fused, as if they had been subjected to intense heat, and the ground was marked. Deep impressions in the soil, circular and precise, as if something incredibly hot had pressed down and seared the earth. I could smell the burnt dirt, acrid and wrong. I took photographs with my old digital camera, the kind with the tiny screen that showed pixelated previews. I documented everything. The fabric, the marks, the compressed earth where something heavy had stood. My hands were steadier now, my mind forcing itself into the familiar patterns of documentation, of gathering evidence, of trying to make sense of the impossible. Later that day, I drove into the village. I needed to tell someone, to show someone what I had found. I went to the police station, a small building that smelled of coffee and old paper, and asked to speak to the officer on duty. When he came out, a young man with a tired expression and a belly that strained against his uniform, I tried to explain what I had seen. I showed him the photographs on the camera, the blurry images of burned fabric and scorched earth. He looked at them for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Then he smiled, a condescending smile that made my chest tighten with frustration. He told me that shadows can play tricks on old eyes, especially at night. He told me that the mind, when isolated too long, can see things that are not there. He suggested, gently but firmly, that I should get more rest, perhaps visit a doctor in town. He did not laugh at me, but he might as well have. I left the station with the camera in my pocket and the weight of disbelief pressing down on my shoulders. No one would listen. No one would believe. I was the old man living alone, the one who had started seeing things. But I had the recording, I had the photographs, and I had the knowledge, certain and cold, that something had survived that crash. Something that did not belong in this world, something that knew my name. After that night in the woods, sleep became something I could no longer trust. The darkness, which had once been a comfort, a familiar blanket that wrapped around the house and the fields, now felt hostile and alive. I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. But beneath those familiar sounds I began to hear others. Metallic sounds, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere outside. They sounded like footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the property. But whenever I gathered the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there. Only the empty yard, the motionless corn, the dark tree line against the stars. The sounds came every night, always in the hours between midnight and dawn. Sometimes they were close, just outside my bedroom window. Sometimes they were distant, near the barn or the chicken coop. I would lie there, rigid with tension, tracking the sounds as they moved around the house. Once, I heard what sounded like something scraping against the outer wall. a long, slow drag of metal on wood. In the morning, I found nothing. No marks, no evidence, just my own exhaustion and the growing certainty that I was not alone. On the seventh night, something new happened. I was lying awake, as usual, when the radio turned on by itself. It sat on the dresser across the room, an old transistor radio that I kept plugged in more out of habit than necessity. The sudden crackle of static made me jolt upright, my heart hammering. I stared at it, watching the dim glow of the dial light, and listened as the static resolved into something else. Voices, not music, not a broadcast easy, but voices speaking in overlapping waves, distorted and truncated. They sounded like military transmissions, clipped words and numbers. But the signal kept breaking up, the voices cutting in and out until they became unintelligible. I got out of bed and approached the radio slowly, as if it might bite. I reached for the power dial, but before I could turn it off, the voices stopped. The static returned, loud and harsh, and then faded to silence. The dial light remained on one, glowing faintly in the darkness. I unplugged it, my hands shaking, and the light went out. I stood there in the dark, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Had I imagined it? Was my mind finally breaking under the strain of isolation and fear? But the radio had been off. I had not touched it. And those voices had been real as my own voice. The next morning, I found the first chicken missing. I went out to feed them, as I did every morning, and counted only 7 where there should have been 8. I searched the coop and the yard, looking for signs of a predator. Feathers, blood, a struggle. But there was nothing. Just the absence of one bird, as if it had simply vanished into the air. Over the next week, the rest disappeared, one by one. I found traces, but they made no sense. Feathers scattered in odd patterns, always damp with a strange, viscous substance that was neither blood nor mud. It was grayish, thick, and had a smell that turned my stomach, metallic and organic at the same time, like the smell of the smoke that still rose faintly from the ridge. I collected some on a piece of cloth and kept it in a sealed jar. Another piece of evidence that no one would believe. The neighbors, when I tried to talk to them, looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. One of them, an old farmer named João who lived 2 properties over, told me he had heard about the helicopter. He said it had been a military training accident, that the area around the crash site was closed off, and that soldiers had been seen securing the perimeter. But I had seen no soldiers. I had seen no barriers. I had driven past the access road that led toward the ridge, and it had been empty. No signs or vehicles or any indication that the military was involved. When I pointed this out, João shrugged and changed the subject. No one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to acknowledge that something strange was happening. I began to feel the weight of isolation in a new way. It was not just the physical distance from others, the empty fields and the long silences. It was the isolation of knowing something that no one else would acknowledge, of seeing evidence that everyone else chose to ignore. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I really was losing my mind. Maybe the crash had never happened. Maybe the figure in the woods had been a trick of shadow and exhaustion. Maybe the sounds in the radio and the missing chickens were all symptoms of a deteriorating mind, the kind of slow unraveling that happens to old men who live alone too long. But then I found the marks on the wall. It was early one morning, just after sunrise, when I noticed them. I had stepped outside to check the weather, the way I always did, and something caught my eye. Dark circles on the white-painted wall of the house, near the corner where the porch met the main structure. I walked over and examined them, running my fingers across the surface. The paint was burned, scorched in perfect circular patterns, each about the size of a dinner plate. There were 6 of them, arranged in a row, each mark distinct and precise. I counted them again, my stomach tightening. 6 circles, not 5. Not 4, 6. I thought of the figure I had seen in the woods, the way its hand had reached toward me, and I realized with a cold certainty what I was looking at: handprints, but not human handprints. These were the marks of something with 6 fingers, pressed against the wall with enough heat to burn through the paint and char the wood beneath. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath my feet. This was not my imagination. This was not exhaustion or isolation or the tricks of an aging mind. This was real, physical, undeniable, Something had been here, close enough to touch the walls of my house, close enough to look through the windows, and it had left proof. The nights grew worse after that. The metallic sounds continued, but now there were new ones. A low hum, almost subsonic, that I felt more than heard. It vibrated through the floor and into my bones. A frequency that made my chest tighten and my teeth ache. It would start around midnight and continue for hours, rising and falling in slow waves. I would lie in bed and feel the house trembling around me, the walls humming with that strange, invisible energy. The air itself seemed to pulse, thick and electric, as if the entire world were breathing in rhythm with something vast and unseen. And then the voices started, not from the radio this time, but from everywhere. Faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls, from the corners of rooms, from the space behind my head. I could not make out words, just the impression of speech, of something trying to communicate. But sometimes, late at night when the humming was at its peak, I would hear my name, Arthur, spoken softly, repeatedly, like a chant or a prayer. The voice was not quite human, not quite mechanical. It was something in between, something that made my skin crawl and my mind recoil. I tried leaving the radio on at night, tuned to a local station, hoping the sound of normal voices would drown out the others. But the station would fade to static, and through the static I would hear them again. Those broken, overlapping transmissions, those voices speaking in codes I could not decipher. And always, eventually, my name. Arthur. Arthur. The syllables stretched and distorted until they became something else, something that no longer sounded like language but like a summons. I stopped sleeping entirely. I would sit in the kitchen with all the lights on, drinking coffee until my hands shook, watching the windows for movement. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision, shadows that moved wrong, shapes that dissolved when I looked directly at them. I told myself it was exhaustion, that my mind was fragmenting from lack of sleep, but I could not shake the feeling that the house was no longer my own, that I was being watched from every corner, from every dark space. During the day, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I worked on the tractor, fixed the fence, went through the motions of living, but the world felt thin, translucent, as if I were looking at it through a veil. The sunlight seemed too bright, the colors too sharp. Everything had taken on a hyper-real quality that made me feel like I was living in a dream or a photograph. And always, in the back of my mind, I could feel it, that presence, that watching thing waiting for night to fall again. I considered leaving, packing a bag, getting in the truck and driving until I reached somewhere with lights and people and noise. But where would I go? What would I tell them? That I was being haunted by something from a crashed helicopter. That my house hummed at night, and voices spoke my name through the walls. They would put me in a hospital or worse. And besides, some part of me knew that leaving would not help. Whatever this was, it had found me. It knew me. And I did not think distance would make any difference. The storm came on September 12th, appearing suddenly in an afternoon that had been clear and bright. I was outside checking the well pump when I noticed the clouds building on the western horizon. They rose like mountains, dark and towering, bruised purple at the base and luminous white at the peaks. The air changed, growing thick and charged, the way it does before lightning. The wind picked up, bending the corn in waves, and I could smell the rain coming, that metallic electric scent that makes animals nervous. I finished with the pump and headed for the house, but the storm moved faster than I expected. By the time I reached the porch, the first drops were falling, heavy and cold, striking the ground with audible impacts. Within minutes, it had become a deluge. Rain fell in sheets, driven nearly horizontal by the wind. I stood on the porch and watched as the sky turned the color of lead, as lightning split the darkness with brilliant, branching forks of white fire. The wind was tremendous, stronger than any I had experienced in my years here. It tore at the roof, ripping loose tiles and sending them spinning into the yard. The shutters banged against the walls, the trees bent double, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the crash of falling branches. The storm howled like a living thing, a sound that was almost vocal, almost intelligent. I went inside and watched through the windows as the world dissolved into chaos. But then, around 9 in the evening, something changed. The rain was still falling, hard and relentless, and the wind was still screaming, but I noticed lights. Not lightning, these were different. 3 points of illumination, steady and unwavering, hovering above the far end of the field. They glowed with a pale greenish-white luminescence, like phosphorescence, and they moved slowly, deliberately, as if unaffected by the wind. I pressed my face against the window, my breath fogging the glass, and watched as they descended, dropping toward the tree line in perfect synchronization. My first thought was helicopters, rescue teams finally responding to the crash. But these lights made no sound. There were no rotors, no engines, no beams cutting through the rain. Just those 3 orbs of cold light, sinking slowly into the forest. I grabbed my recorder, the one I now carried with me everywhere, and threw on my coat. I do not know what I was thinking. Perhaps I was not thinking at all. Perhaps the isolation and the fear and the sleepless nights had eroded my sense of self-preservation. But I needed to know. I needed to see. The rain hit me like a wall as soon as I stepped outside. It was cold, shockingly cold, and within seconds I was soaked through. The wind tried to push me back, to force me toward the house, but I lowered my head and walked forward, toward the barn, toward the field, toward those impossible lights. The ground was already turning to mud, sucking at my boots with each step. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the landscape in stuttering frames. Corn bent low, the barn doors swinging wildly, the distant trees thrashing in the wind. And then the rain stopped, not gradually, not tapering off into it, but all at once, as if someone had closed a tap. One moment I was struggling through a downpour, and the next I was standing in absolute stillness. The wind died. The thunder ceased. Even the sound of water dripping from the eaves seemed to fade into silence. The only sound was my own breathing, harsh and loud in the sudden quiet. I looked up at the sky. The clouds were still there, roiling and dark, but they had stopped moving. Everything had stopped moving. And the air. The air had a quality to it that I had never experienced before. It was thick, electric, almost solid, pressing against my skin with a sensation that was not quite touch, not quite heat. I could smell ozone and something else, something metallic and sweet like burnt copper mixed with flowers. The lights were closer now. I could see them clearly through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away. They pulsed gently, breathing in and out, casting long shadows that moved in ways that did not match the position of the light sources. I walked toward them, my feet moving almost against my will, drawn by a curiosity that had become indistinguishable from compulsion. The recorder was running in my pocket, capturing everything, or so I hoped. As I reached the edge of the forest, I saw them. Figures moving between the trees. 4 of them, maybe more. Shapes that were almost human but fundamentally wrong. They were dragging something, pulling it through the mud and leaves, something large and heavy covered by a tarp or sheet. I could hear the wet sound of it moving, the scrape of fabric against ground, the labored breathing of the figures as they worked. I opened my mouth to shout, to call out, but no sound came. My throat had closed, my voice stolen by fear or shock or something else. One of the figures stopped. It turned toward me, and in the pulsing glow of those floating lights, I saw it clearly for the first time. This was not the same creature I had encountered before, or perhaps it was, but changed, deteriorated. The body was humanoid in the vaguest sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at angles that made me wince. The skin, if it could be called skin, looked wet and translucent, like something that had been underwater too long. The head turned toward me, and I saw the eyes. They were enormous, black, reflective, with no discernible pupil or iris, just 2 vast empty pools that caught the light and threw it back. The mouth opened, a vertical slit rather than horizontal, and a sound emerged. It was not a voice. It was not words. It was a vibration, a frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight into my skull, into my bones, into the core of my being. The pain was immediate and absolute. My head felt like it was splitting open. I could feel something warm running from my nose, and when I touched my face, my hand came away wet with blood. The sound continued, rising in pitch and intensity, and I fell to my knees, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But it was not a sound you could block. It was everywhere, inside and outside, a resonance that shook every cell in my body. The other figures had stopped now, turning toward me. They stood there in the pulsing light, motionless, watching. I tried to stand, tried to run, but my legs would not respond. The world began to tilt and blur, the edges of my vision darkening. I could feel myself falling, the ground rushing up to meet me, and then nothing. Darkness, silence, an absence so complete it felt like death. When I woke, I was on the porch. The sun was up, bright and warm, streaming across the yard. I was lying on my back, staring up at the roof, my clothes stiff with dried mud. My head throbbed, a deep, nauseating pain that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. I touched my face and felt the dried blood crusted around my nose and mouth. How long had I been unconscious? Hours, days. The light suggested morning, but which morning? I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My camera was gone. The recorder was gone. I checked my pockets frantically, but they were empty. Everything I had carried with me, everything I had hoped to use as evidence, had vanished. I looked out at the field, at the tree line, trying to remember what I had seen. The images were there, burned into my memory, but they felt distant now, unreal, like something from a dream. 2 days later, they came. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat but unable to taste anything, when I heard the vehicles. Multiple engines, heavy trucks, approaching from the main road. I went to the window and saw them. Military vehicles, 3 of them, painted in that flat matte green. They pulled into the yard and stopped. Engines idling and soldiers climbed out. Real soldiers this time, in full gear, carrying rifles, their faces hidden behind visors and masks. An officer approached the house. He knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that made me jump. I opened it slowly, and he looked at me with eyes that were hard and cold and utterly without sympathy. He told me, in a voice that expected no argument, that I needed to stay inside, that the area was being cleared of hazardous materials, that I was not to leave my property or speak to anyone about what I might have seen. He did not phrase it as a request. I asked him what they had found up on the ridge. What had crashed? What was out there in the woods? His expression did not change. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see something in his eyes, not just authority, but warning. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and flat. He said that I had not seen anything, that there was nothing to see, that if I spoke about this to anyone, there would be consequences. He did not specify what those consequences might be, but the implication was clear. I watched from the window as they worked. The soldiers moved through the property and into the forest, carrying equipment I did not recognize. I could hear machinery in the distance, the sound of engines and metal and something being loaded. By afternoon, they had erected barriers, black tarps strung between poles, blocking my view of the tree line. The work continued into the night, floodlights turning the forest into a stage, silhouettes moving against the artificial brightness. They left the next morning. All of them, the trucks and the equipment, the barriers. They took everything and left the forest looking untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. But the smell remained, faint but persistent, that strange organic smoke that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. And the silence remained. The birds did not return. The insects did not sing. The air felt empty, hollow, as if something essential had been scraped out of the world and taken away. After they left, after the trucks rolled away and the forest returned to its artificial stillness, I tried to resume my life. I tried to fall back into the old rhythms, the morning coffee, the feeding routine, the repairs that never ended. But nothing was the same. The house felt different. The land felt different. I felt different. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in the world around me, but in my understanding of what the world was, what it could be, what might be hiding just beneath the surface of ordinary reality. I went to the police station again one last time. I took the few remaining photographs I had saved, the ones stored on a memory card I kept hidden in a drawer. But when I inserted the card into the computer at the station, when the young officer pulled up the files, we found nothing. The images were corrupted, reduced to digital noise, patterns of colored pixels that formed no recognizable shapes. The officer looked at me with that same expression of gentle pity, and I understood then that there would be no evidence, no proof, no validation. Everything I had captured, everything I had documented, had been erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. He suggested again that I should see a doctor, perhaps someone who could help me with stress, with the difficulty of living alone at my age, perhaps some medication to help me sleep, to quiet the thoughts that clearly troubled me. He meant well, I think. He was not cruel, just unable to comprehend anything outside his limited experience. And so I thanked him, took my corrupted memory card, and drove home. I have not been back since. The whispers started almost immediately. In the village, in the market, among the neighbors I had known for decades, the old man who lives alone, the one who sees things, poor Arthur, losing his mind out there by himself. Maybe it is time for him to move to town, to be closer to people, to have someone check on him. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, already lost to whatever deterioration they imagined was claiming me. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was lost, but not in the way they thought. I am known now as the crazy old man who talks about monsters and phantom helicopters, the one who rambles about lights in the sky and voices in the walls. When I go to town for supplies, people avoid my eyes. Conversations stop when I approach. Checkout clerks are polite but distant, processing my purchases quickly and handing me my change without meeting my gaze. I have become invisible, or worse than invisible. I have become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when you live too long in isolation. When you let your mind drift too far from the anchors of community and rationality. But at night, when the town and its skeptics are far away, I know the truth. The silence persists, deeper and more complete than any natural silence should be. The birds have not returned, neither have the insects. The field feels empty, in a way that has nothing to do with the absence of crops or animals, and everything to do with the absence of something essential, something that made this place feel alive. On certain nights, especially when the wind comes from the direction of the ridge, I feel it, that low-frequency hum, that vibration that seems to rise from deep underground, from some cavity or chamber or presence that pulses with its own rhythm. I have explored the area near the crash site, walking the perimeter of where the military erected their barriers. The trees there look wrong. The leaves are too dark, the bark too smooth, as if something has changed them at a molecular level. Nothing grows in certain spots, perfect circles of bare earth where even weeds refuse to take root. Sometimes, when the light hits the ground just right, I can see faint patterns in the soil, geometric shapes that could be natural formations but feel too precise, too intentional. I have stopped trying to convince anyone. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from knowing something no one else believes, from seeing evidence that everyone else dismisses. It is worse than physical isolation. It is the isolation of the mind, of lived experience that cannot be shared or validated. I have learned that the truth, when it stands alone without witnesses, becomes indistinguishable from delusion. And perhaps that is the real horror, not what happened, but the impossibility of making it matter to anyone else. I think often about what I saw that night in the storm. The figures, the lights, the thing they were dragging through the forest. What was it? Where did they take it? And more troubling still, were there others? The officer who came to my door, with his cold eyes and his carefully worded warnings, knew something. The military removed something from those woods, something significant enough to require secrecy and threats. But what remains? What did they miss? What might still be out there? Watching from the darkness, adapting, learning, becoming something that can pass unnoticed among us. I write this not because I expect anyone to believe me. I write it because I need to externalize what I know, to get it out of my head and onto paper where it can exist independently of my failing memory. I am 76 years old. My hands shake now, even during the day. My heart beats irregularly, skipping and stuttering in ways that remind me my time is limited. When I am gone, this account may be all that remains, a testament not to what I saw, but to what seeing cost me. I have discovered something about truth that I wish I had never learned. Truth does not bring peace. Truth does not set you free. Truth, when it stands alone against the comfortable consensus of shared illusion, brings only isolation and doubt. The price of seeing what others cannot or will not see is to live in the space between sanity and madness, never quite sure which side you occupy, never able to fully trust your own perceptions. That is the real consequence of what happened here. Not the fear, not the danger, but the fundamental severing of my connection to the shared reality that makes human community possible. The world is not what we think it is. That is what I learned. Beneath the familiar surface of fields and forests and sky, beneath the comfortable illusion of a knowable, predictable universe, there are cracks. There are spaces where other things exist, other intelligences, other forms of being that do not conform to our categories or our expectations. We tell ourselves we understand the world, that science has mapped its boundaries and explained its mysteries. But we are wrong. We are children playing at the edge of an ocean we cannot fathom, convinced that the shallow water at our feet represents the totality of what exists. I do not know what came down in that helicopter. I do not know if it was from somewhere else or from some hidden depth of our own world. I do not know if it was alive in any sense we would recognize, or if it was something between alive and not alive, something that operates according to rules we have never imagined. But I know it was real. I know it saw me. And I know with a certainty that has settled into my bones like cold that it has not left. Not entirely, not yet. If you find this recording, if somehow this account survives beyond my death and finds its way into hands that might understand, I ask only one thing. Do not go to the ridge. Do not search for the crash site. Do not try to find evidence or proof or validation of what I have described here. Because if you find something, if you discover what was inside that wreckage, what the military removed or what they left behind, you will understand what I cannot fully articulate. You will understand that some truths are not meant to be known, that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The silence is permanent now. The birds will not return. The insects will not sing. The land has been altered in ways that go beyond the physical, ways that touch something fundamental about the nature of life and death and the spaces between them. I can feel it when I walk the property. That absence, that void where something vital used to be. It is as if the crash punctured something, created a wound in the fabric of normal reality, and that wound has not healed. Perhaps it never will. I am tired now, tired in a way that sleep cannot cure. I am tired of watching, tired of listening, tired of waiting for something I cannot name. The nights are the worst. That is when I hear it most clearly. Not the voices anymore, but something underneath them, something that might be machinery or might be breathing or might be both. It comes from below, from deep in the earth, a rhythm that suggests something vast and patient, something content to wait in the darkness until the time is right. I no longer fear death. What I fear is dying without having been believed, without having made anyone understand that what happened here matters, that it should matter, that the comfortable ignorance we wrap around ourselves like a blanket is thin and fragile and could be torn away at any moment. But perhaps that is the nature of truth. It does not care whether we believe it or not. It exists regardless, patient and implacable, waiting for the moment when denial becomes impossible. This is my final testimony. This is what I know. This is what I saw. If you have read this far, you might understand why I have spent so much time documenting, recording, trying to create a record that might outlast my credibility and my life. Because in the end, what else do we have but our stories? And what good are stories if no one believes them? The sun is setting now. The shadows are lengthening across the field. Soon it will be dark again, and the silence will deepen, and I will sit here in my kitchen with all the lights on, listening to the house and the land and the spaces beneath them, waiting for whatever comes next. I do not sleep anymore. I do not dream. I only watch and listen and remember. If you are reading this, if my words have reached you across time or distance or the barrier of credibility that separates truth from fiction, then perhaps you will understand why I ended this recording the way I did, why I left it running, even knowing what might be captured, why I placed it where someone might eventually find it long after I am gone. Listen carefully to what comes next. Listen to the background, to the sounds beneath the silence. You will hear what I hear every night, what has become the soundtrack of my final days. A distant thrumming growing slowly closer, the sound of rotors, but wrong somehow, too deep, too rhythmic, too much like breathing. It is getting closer now. I can feel the vibration through the floor, through the walls, through the bones of this old house. The lights are flickering. The air is growing thick. And I am recording this, documenting until the very end, because that is all I have left to do. If you find this, do not come looking for me. Do not come looking for the source. Just know that it was real. All of it was real, and it never really left. It is here now, It has always been here. It has always been.